I have ordered men to disappear. I have watched grown men change their answers because I looked at them for 1 second too long. Fear has always belonged to everyone else. Until this morning. On a cold Tuesday in October, I was sitting on rain-soaked pavement outside the Regency Seoul, wearing a torn jacket that smelled of old cigarettes and damp concrete. Not because I had lost my empire, because I needed to know whether the woman who left had been running from me or from the world I built around her. Her name was Deborah. 7 months ago, she vanished without a note or a phone call. Then one of my men sent me a photograph, and I sat with it until sunrise. Deborah was pregnant. When she stepped out of that car and her eyes found mine, she did not walk away. She crossed the wet pavement and sat down beside me. No explanation, no eye contact, just a decision I had not expected from someone I thought I knew completely. That was when I understood. The test had stopped being hers. It had become mine. She sat beside me for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I counted. When you have spent 20 years running an organization where timing determines who goes home and who does not, you learn to measure everything. 4 minutes and 17 seconds on wet pavement outside a 5-star hotel, in a cream maternity dress that probably cost more than the cardboard sign against my knees. She did not speak, neither did I. The hotel doorman kept stealing glances in our direction, clearly unsure whether to intervene. The driver had returned to the car and was staring straight ahead with the disciplined discomfort of a man paid not to have opinions. The man in the dark suit had disappeared through the hotel entrance, and I had not decided yet whether that was deliberate. Deborah looked straight ahead at the traffic moving along the boulevard, her hand resting against her belly. Her breathing was calm, too calm for someone who had just chosen to sit beside a stranger on the street. That bothered me more than anything else. I had expected one of 3 responses. Discomfort followed by a polite offering of money. Complete indifference as she walked past. Or, if something in my posture or voice triggered recognition, panic. I had not planned for stillness. After the 4th minute, she reached into the bag beside her and removed a small paper bag. She set it carefully between us without looking at me. Then she checked the time on her phone, rose from the ground with the careful balance of someone far enough along to move slowly, and brushed off her dress. She walked back toward the hotel entrance. At the door, she paused. She turned, not fully, just enough for her profile to catch the gray morning light, and said something so quietly that the passing traffic nearly swallowed it. "You should eat something. You look like you have not slept in days." Then she was gone. I sat with the paper bag between my knees for a moment. Inside was a container of warm soup from the hotel restaurant and a bread roll wrapped in cloth. No note, no dramatic gesture. She had not looked around to see who noticed. She had not waited for thanks. She had simply left the food there and walked away. That was harder to dismiss than kindness performed in public. I stayed with that thought longer than I intended. Then the second thought arrived, and it was colder. Something was wrong, not with what she had done, with how she had done it. The stillness, the 4 minutes of silence, the way she had never once looked at me with the natural curiosity of someone studying a stranger they had just decided to sit beside. She had not studied me at all, which meant either she had extraordinary self-control, or she already knew exactly who was sitting beneath the dirt. I should have left after she went inside. Phase 1 of the test was complete. She had passed it more cleanly than I expected, and staying longer only increased the risk of exposure. The professional decision was to go. I did not go. 15 minutes later, a security guard approached from the left, young, broad-shouldered, with the practiced expression of someone who had cleared this pavement before. He told me politely but firmly that I needed to move on. I was preparing to stand when the hotel doors opened again. Deborah came back out. She spoke to the guard before he reached me. I could not hear the full exchange, but his posture changed within seconds. He nodded once, glanced at me with visible uncertainty, and returned to his post without another word. She stopped a few feet away, not quite looking at me. "He was going to call someone," she said quietly. "I told him you were waiting for a staff member on the morning shift." I said nothing. "It is not true," she added, "but it gives you time." She turned to leave. I made a decision I had not planned for. "Why?" I asked. She considered the question longer than it should have required. "Because nobody else was going to," she said. She walked back toward the entrance. I watched her the way I had been trained to watch people, cataloging details without appearing to, the measured steps, the composure that did not look performed, as though the discipline was simply part of how she was built. I had spent 2 years with this woman and believed I understood her completely. Standing on this pavement now, I was considerably less certain. Then she reached into her bag for her phone, and a cream-colored key sleeve shifted near the opening. I caught only 2 things before she pushed it back down: the Regency Soul crest, and the number 714 written by hand in black ink. I kept my face still. The 7th floor of the Regency Soul held only 3 suites, and my organization had monitored all 3 corporate accounts for over a year. Standard procedure. One of those accounts belonged to a man who had been quietly working to dismantle everything I had spent 20 years building. His name was Kwon Dae-jung. Deborah was staying in his suite. She paused at the entrance without turning around. "The soup is getting cold," she said. The doors closed behind her. I sat on the wet pavement without moving, the container of soup between my knees, the bread roll untouched beside it. I had come here with one objective: observe her, measure her character, decide whether she was worth bringing back into my life. But the woman I had been watching for the past hour was not hiding in a quiet corner of the city, surviving alone. She was living inside the territory of my most dangerous enemy, and she did not look afraid of anything. I gave her a 30-second head start. Then I left the pavement. My second team was already positioned: 1 man in the lobby, 1 near the elevator bank, a 3rd watching the side exit that most guests never noticed. I had not built what I built by leaving things to chance, and I was not about to start now. What I expected to find was a woman being kept comfortable by a wealthy man in exchange for something. It was a story I had seen many times. Seeing it again would have made the next decision easier. What I found had no framework I could place it in. At 11:20 that morning, Deborah left the hotel through the main entrance. Alone. No driver. No dark suit. Just her bag, a light jacket, and the careful way she moved through a crowded pavement without drawing attention to herself. I followed at distance, and my man fell in 30 meters behind me. She took the subway. Not a taxi. Not a hired car. The subway gripping the overhead rail with one hand, while the carriage filled around her. 2 people offered their seats. She declined both with a small shake of her head. When the train jerked hard through a tunnel bend and she caught the rail with both hands, she finally accepted the 3rd offer, without argument, and sat down quietly for the remaining stops. We rode 4 stops south. The neighborhood surrounding the exit was not poor, but it was not the Regency soul either. Narrow streets, small restaurants, a medical clinic on the corner whose sign listed obstetric services among others. She did not go to the clinic. She stopped at a residential building 2 streets from the station and used a key to enter. My man confirmed the registered occupant within 6 minutes. The apartment belonged to a woman named Park So-yeon, 63 years old, retired schoolteacher. Deborah stayed inside for 2 hours and 40 minutes. When she came back out, she carried an empty food container and a folded piece of paper. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. The kind of tired that comes from carrying sustained responsibility for a long time without setting it down. I waited until her taxi turned out of sight. Then I called my man. Find out everything about the woman in that apartment, and find out how long Deborah has been coming here. The answer came back 40 minutes later. Park So-yeon had been admitted to a memory care facility 4 months ago. The apartment lease was still active, paid through the end of the year by automatic transfer. The apartment was empty. Deborah had been visiting an empty apartment, bringing food to no one, sitting alone inside the home of a woman who no longer remembered it existed. The question was no longer what she had been hiding. The question was who had made it necessary to hide it at all. Park So-yeon was not difficult to find. The memory care facility was 40 minutes outside the city, quiet and well-maintained, the kind of place that cost more per month than most people earned in 3. I noted that detail and kept moving. She was sitting by a window in the common room when I arrived, watching the garden with the distant expression of someone whose thoughts had stopped anchoring to the present. The staff had confirmed she was having a clearer afternoon, which was the most anyone could promise with her condition. I sat across from her and introduced myself using a name that was not mine. She looked at me for a long moment. "You have the same eyes as someone I used to know," she said. I let that pass and asked her gently about Deborah. Something shifted in her face, not confusion. Something closer to grief, moving through a mind that could no longer hold it in one place for very long. She told me that Deborah had been visiting her for nearly 5 months before the facility, every week without missing one. She told me Deborah had helped manage her medications, her appointments, her paperwork, had done all of it quietly, without being asked, without telling anyone. She never wanted anyone to know, Park So-yeon said. She said the less people knew about her, the safer everyone would be. I kept my expression neutral. Did she say why? I asked. The older woman looked back toward the garden. Her hands moved slowly against the armrests, as though she were trying to hold on to a thought that kept sliding away. She said someone had told her, she said finally. Someone she trusted. They told her that the people around her would get hurt if she stayed visible, that the only way to protect the people she loved was to disappear quietly and not leave the trail. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Did she tell you who said that to her? I asked. Park So-yeon turned back to me with the particular clarity that sometimes appears without warning in people with her condition, the kind that does not last long but carries everything inside it. She didn't have to, she said. I met him once. He came with her, early on, before she stopped bringing anyone. Well-dressed man, very polite. She paused. He asked a lot of questions about whether she had contacted anyone from her previous life. I asked her to describe him. She did. The drive back to the city took 40 minutes. I spent most of it staring at the road without seeing it. The man Park Soyan had described was not a stranger to me. He was not an enemy either. He was the man who had stood beside Deborah's car that morning, opening her door with the quiet ease of someone who had made himself permanent in her life. He had been there from the beginning. I just had not known why. I have a very clear memory of the night Deborah left. We had argued, not violently, nothing that should have ended 2 years in a single evening, but with the particular exhaustion of two people who had been circling the same unresolved thing for months. She had told me she needed more than I was capable of giving. I had told her that what I gave her was more than most people in my world received and survived. She had gone quiet in the way that I had learned, meant the conversation was over. I woke up the next morning, and she was gone. I had spent 7 months constructing a clean story around that night. She had wanted a normal life. I could not offer one. She had made a rational decision and executed it with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. It was painful, but it was logical. People left when the cost of staying became too high. That was the memory I had carried. Sitting in my car outside the facility, I called a man named Cho, who handled sensitive information retrieval for my organization, and asked him to pull the archived security footage from my residential building, covering the week before Deborah disappeared. The footage arrived within the hour. She had not left the morning after our argument. She had left 4 days later, at 2:40 in the afternoon, while I was confirmed to be across the city in a meeting that my own calendar had scheduled. She had used the service exit, which avoided every camera she would have known about. She had known which cameras to avoid because I had shown her myself 18 months earlier, explaining the building's security layout during a conversation I had completely misremembered as casual. There was more. 3 days before she left, a vehicle I did not recognize had parked outside the building for 6 hours. The plates came back registered to a logistics company that had been dissolved the following month. My man ran the dissolution records and found the company's sole director listed under a name I did not immediately recognize. It took me 4 minutes to trace the name backward through 2 shell registrations to the man who actually owned it. Kwon Dae-jung. He had been outside my building 3 days before Deborah left. She had used an exit she only knew about because I had trusted her with it. And the argument I remembered as the reason she left had happened 4 days before she actually walked out. Which meant the argument was not what made her go. Something had happened in those 4 days. Something I had no memory of because I had not been watching for it. She had not left because she wanted a different life. She had been moved. The question sitting in the center of everything now was not whether Kwon Dae-jung had orchestrated her disappearance. It was what he had told her about me to make her willing to go. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the desk in my private office and worked through everything Cho had pulled, building the sequence forward and backward until the shape of it became impossible to argue with. Kwon Dae-jung had not appeared in Deborah's life after she left mine. He had been present before, quietly, carefully, in places I had not thought to look because they were too close to look at clearly. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I found the first internal record that did not belong. It was a communication log from 7 months ago, routed through a secondary channel my organization used for sensitive operational updates. The log showed a location ping from Deborah's personal phone, submitted by one of my own men 3 days before she left. The ping had not been sent to me. It had been sent to a private number I did not recognize. I sat with that for a long time. I gave the number to Cho at 4 o'clock in the morning and told him I needed a full trace before sunrise. He called back in 40 minutes, and the silence before he spoke told me more than I wanted to know. The number belonged to a man named Ryu Sungmin. Ryu had worked inside my organization for 11 years. He managed internal communications, which meant he controlled what information reached me and in what form. I had trusted him the way you trust infrastructure, without thinking about it, because it had always simply worked. He had been routing selected intelligence to Kwon for, as far as Cho could determine, at least 14 months. 14 months. I thought about what had existed in my life 14 months ago. The expansion into the Eastern Distribution Network. The consolidation of 3 rival operations into one structure under my control. The period during which I had been most exposed and most dependent on the information coming through internal channels. The period during which Deborah and I had begun arguing with the particular exhaustion of 2 people who no longer understood each other. I stood up from the desk and walked to the window. Ryu had access to everything, every meeting, every threat assessment, every piece of information Kwon would have needed to construct a convincing case that Deborah was in danger because of her proximity to me. He could have fed her selected evidence, genuine incidents, reframed and timed carefully, delivered through a man she had no reason to distrust. She had not left because she stopped believing in me. She had left because someone had used the truth as a weapon, selecting the parts that would frighten her most and removing everything that provided context. She had been told a version of my life that was accurate in every detail and completely dishonest in its conclusion. And the man who had built that version was still inside my organization. He had been there this morning when I left for the hotel. He had known exactly where I was going, which meant Kwon Dae-jung had known too. By morning, I had made 2 decisions. The first was that Ryu Sungmin would be removed from my organization before the end of the week, quietly and permanently, in a way that left no room for explanation or appeal. The second was that I needed to understand why Deborah had come back to Seoul, because nothing in the picture I had assembled so far gave me a satisfying answer. She had left to stay safe. She had built a hidden, careful existence. She had stayed away for 7 months without a single contact. People who work that hard to disappear do not resurface without a reason that outweighs the risk. Cho found it by tracing the medical appointments registered under a secondary name Deborah had been using since her return. She had seen 3 different specialists in the past 6 weeks. The appointments were not routine. 2 were with a maternal fetal medicine consultant at a private hospital in the Mapo district. 1 was with a cardiovascular specialist on the same floor of the same building. I read the specialist's name twice. The cardiovascular appointment was not for Deborah. It was for a patient referred through her, listed under Park So-yeon's national identification number, despite the fact that Park So-yeon was 40 minutes outside the city in a memory care facility and had not left its grounds in 4 months. Someone was using the old woman's identity to access a specialist they could not reach under their own name. I called Cho and told him to cross-reference the appointment time with the Regency Seoul's entrance logs. The answer took 8 minutes. Kwon Dae-jung had left the hotel for 4 hours on the morning of that appointment. His driver had logged a Mapo district destination. The timing aligned exactly. Deborah had not come back to Seoul for reconciliation, and she had not come back simply for medical care. She had come back because Kwon Dae-jung was ill. seriously enough to require a specialist he could not visit under his own name, without the information reaching people he could not afford to have know his condition. She had come back because he needed her. I sat with the implications of that for longer than was comfortable. A man who had spent 14 months orchestrating her disappearance, who had used her fear to move her like a piece across a board, was now dependent on her discretion and her willingness to absorb risk on his behalf. And she was doing it. The question I could not resolve was whether she understood the position she was actually in, whether she knew what Kwan's deteriorating condition meant for the people inside his organization who had been managing operations on the assumption of his continued authority. If his rivals found out he was weakened, the first thing they would do was remove every person connected to him. Deborah was connected to him. She was living in his suite, running his errands, carrying his secrets. She had walked out of my world to stay safe, and she had walked directly into something far more dangerous. I went back the next morning. I told myself it was operational. I needed to maintain the position until I had enough to act on, and appearing then, disappearing, would raise questions with the hotel staff. Consistency was part of any credible cover. These were all reasonable justifications, and I was aware that none of them were the actual reason. I was back on the pavement by 8:50. She came out at 9:30, alone again, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the hotel lobby. She sat beside me without greeting and placed 1 cup near my knee without comment. We sat in the same configuration as the morning before, facing the boulevard, not quite looking at each other. "You were here yesterday," she said. "The morning shift never came," I said. She accepted that without response. We sat in silence for several minutes. A delivery van blocked the entrance briefly. The doorman exchanged words with the driver. Ordinary morning machinery, moving around 2 people who were not moving with it. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. The question was light, conversational, the kind a compassionate person asks a stranger to make them feel less invisible. I answered with a background I had prepared. Busan, family and manufacturing, a series of bad investments, a divorce, the particular sequence of misfortune that lands a person on a pavement with a cardboard sign. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My father was from Busan," she said. "He always said people from there speak with their shoulders. Something about the way they carry themselves, even when they are trying not to." She looked at me directly for the first time that morning. "You carry yourself like someone who has never once needed to ask for anything." The observation landed with a precision that I did not allow to reach my face. "People change," I said. "Yes," she said. "They do." She finished her coffee, checked her phone, and stood to leave. Then she paused in the way she had the day before, as though the pause itself had become deliberate. "The man you described," she said. "The divorce. The investments. What was the name of the manufacturing company?" I gave her the name Cho had built into the cover 3 days ago, complete with registration records and a verifiable history. She nodded slowly, as though filing it somewhere. "I hope the morning shift comes today," she said. She walked back inside. I sat very still on the pavement. In 20 years, I had interviewed hundreds of people. I knew the difference between a question asked out of curiosity and a question asked to measure the speed and texture of an answer. She had not asked about the company because she was interested in manufacturing. She had asked because she already knew the answer. She was not sitting beside me out of compassion. Deborah was running her own investigation, and she was considerably better at hiding it than I had given her credit for. Cho called at 6 o'clock in the evening with the kind of voice he only used when the information was going to cost me something. He had finished the full trace on Deborah's movements across the 7 months she had been gone. Not just Seoul. Everything. The trail began in Jeju, moved through 2 cities I had not expected, and settled in Seoul 6 weeks ago. Standard enough for someone building a careful disappearance. Then he told me about the money. Across the 7 months, 11 transfers had been made from an account registered under Deborah's secondary identity into a corporate holding structure. The amounts were not small. The holding structure, after 3 layers of registration, resolved to a company that managed logistics contracts for 2 of my rival operations. People who had been actively working to collapse my Eastern network for the better part of a year. Cho read me the transfer dates without commentary. I wrote them down. The first transfer had been made 9 days after she left. I sat with that for a long time, long enough for the room to get dark around me without noticing. Everything I had been constructing over the past 4 days, the careful architecture of her as someone who had been manipulated, someone who had left out of genuine fear and genuine protection, developed a crack I could not argue away. She had been funding my rivals for 7 months, while I had been telling myself she was a woman wrongly frightened by a man she had trusted. She had been moving money into organizations designed to dismantle everything I owned. I called Cho back and told him to verify the account ownership again. He had already verified it twice. I poured a drink and did not touch it. At 9:14 that evening, a second call came in. Cho again. He had continued pulling threads after our first call, which was what made him valuable and occasionally unbearable. He had traced the instruction origin for the 11 transfers, going further back than the account itself, looking for the hand that had opened it. The account had been opened in Deborah's secondary name, but the digital fingerprints of its construction pointed to a single device. That device was registered to Ryu Sung-min, my internal communications man, the one who had been feeding intelligence to Kwon Dae-jung for 14 months, the one who had controlled what information reached me and in what form. Ryu had built the account. Ryu had structured the transfers. He had done it under her name, using identification documents he had access to through my own organization's records. Deborah had not funded my rivals. She had been framed for it. The money had moved through her identity without her knowledge, creating a paper trail that would destroy her credibility with anyone who found it, including me. Especially me. I stood up slowly. Ryu had not just been working for Kwon Dae-jung. He had been building a case, a careful, documented, completely believable case that would ensure that if Deborah ever tried to tell me the truth about what had happened, I would already have evidence that made her impossible to trust. Someone had planned this long before she left. The question was how deep inside my organization that plan had started. I pulled Ryu from his apartment at midnight. No warning, no intermediary. 2 of my most trusted men brought him to a building in the Seongdong district that my organization used for conversations requiring complete privacy. I was already there when they arrived. He looked at me the way people look when they understand that a particular door has closed behind them permanently. I gave him one opportunity to speak before I asked anything. Some people reveal more in the first unguided sentence than in everything that follows. Ryu used his to tell me that he had not had a choice, which was the answer of a man who understood the game was finished and had decided to spend his remaining goodwill on partial honesty. I asked him who had given him the instruction to frame Deborah. He told me it had not come from Kwon De-jung. I asked him to repeat that. He did. Kwon had been the external contact, the man who received the intelligence and managed Deborah's relocation. But the original instruction, the decision to remove her from my life, to construct the false paper trail, to ensure she could never return without appearing compromised, had come from inside my own family structure. It had come from my uncle. Yoon Tae-suk had been the operational architect of my organization before I took full control. He had stepped back formally 3 years ago, citing age and a preference for distance from daily operations. I had accepted that narrative because it was convenient, and because I had loved him since childhood in the uncomplicated way that survives most evidence against it. I sat with Ryu's answer for a long time. Then I asked him why. He told me that 18 months ago, Deborah had found something she was not supposed to find. She had been in my private office waiting for me when a document had come through on an open channel, a financial record that connected my uncle's personal accounts to a series of transactions that had nothing to do with our organization's operations. She had not understood immediately what she was looking at, but Yoon Tae-suk had seen her close the document when he entered the room. He had spent the following 3 months deciding what to do about it. What he had done was build a mechanism that removed her quietly, discredited her preemptively, and left me with the kind of loss I would eventually absorb and file away as the cost of the life I had chosen. He had calculated correctly on every point except one. He had not accounted for the photograph. I left the building at 2 o'clock in the morning and sat in my car without starting it. My uncle had not protected the organization by removing Deborah. He had protected himself. And somewhere in a hotel suite across the city, Deborah was carrying a child whose grandfather had just become the most dangerous man in her world. She did not know that yet. The question was whether my uncle already knew she was back. My uncle called at 7 o'clock in the morning. Not unusual. He called most mornings, a habit from the years when he ran daily operations and needed the rhythm of early contact to feel oriented. I had always taken his calls without thinking about it. That morning, I sat watching the phone until it stopped. Cho confirmed it within the hour. Yoon Tae-suk had made 4 other calls between midnight and 7 a.m. 2 to numbers inside my organization, 1 to Kwon De-jung's private line, 1 to a man who handled problems that required no documentation and no follow-up. My uncle knew Deborah was back. He had known since the morning I sat on the pavement outside the Regency Seoul. I thought about Ryu and about how long the man had been inside my organization and understood that the pavement had not been as private as I had designed it to be. Someone had reported back. The test I had constructed in careful secrecy had been visible from the inside before I had even arrived. I made 3 calls in the following 20 minutes. The first was to the man who handled Kwon De-jung's medical arrangements, a contact I had identified through Cho's earlier work. I told him that Kwon's next appointment needed to be moved to a facility under my organization's direct oversight. The message that carried was unambiguous. Kwon De-jung was no longer operating in uncontested space. The second call was to my own legal architect, a woman who had worked with me for 9 years and who understood that when I called before 8 a.m., the matter was not procedural. I told her I needed 2 things prepared by end of day: a protection structure for an individual whose safety had become a primary organizational priority, and a document transferring ownership of a residential property in the Hannam district into a name she would receive by text within the hour. The third call was the one that cost me something. I called the Regency Soul and asked for Suite 714. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to assume anything about unexpected contact. "It is me," I said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a person reorganizing everything they had decided, checking it against a reality that had just shifted. "I know what you found in my office 18 months ago," I said. "I know why you left. I know who built the account in your name and why. I know about Kwan's condition and why you came back." She said nothing. "I also know my uncle made a call this morning that you do not have time to wait through," I said. "Yoon Ji-hoon." Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I need you to trust me for the next 4 hours," I said. "Not because of what we were, because of what is coming if you stay in that building without my people around you." She was quiet for a long moment. "You have not asked about the child," she said. Everything I had prepared to say next stopped completely. "Is the child mine?" I asked. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice had the quality of someone setting down something they had been carrying for a very long time. "Come upstairs," she said. "Use the service entrance on the left side of the building. 3rd floor landing, then the staff elevator. You will not be seen." She ended the call. I sat in the car for 3 seconds, understanding that she had just directed me through an entrance route she should not have known existed unless she had already mapped every point of access and exit in the building. This was not a woman who had been surviving on instinct and goodwill. This was a woman who had been running her own operation from inside mine. She was standing by the window when I entered the suite, her back to the door, looking out at the city. The room was neat in the particular way of someone who had made temporary space feel deliberate. She turned when I closed the door, and we regarded each other across the suite in the silence of 2 people who had both been pretending for longer than was comfortable. "You knew," I said. "On the pavement, the first morning." "Third sentence," she said. "You used your left hand to adjust the sign. You always default to your left hand under low-grade stress. You have done it since the 2nd month I knew you." I had run a 20-year organization on the principle that I was not readable. She had read me in 3 sentences on wet pavement. "Why didn't you walk away?" I asked. She considered the question the way she considered all of them, without performance. "Because I needed to know if you had sent the man outside Park So-yeon's building," she said. "The one who had been watching the apartment for 3 weeks. If you had, I was leaving Seoul by evening. If you hadn't, it meant someone inside your organization was moving independently, which meant the danger was different from what I had been managing." "It was Ryu," I said. "I know," she said. "I identified him 6 weeks ago. I needed you to find him yourself, because evidence I handed you could be dismissed. Evidence you built could not." The room was very quiet. She had not come back for Kwan. She had not come back out of residual feeling or unresolved history. She had come back because she had identified a threat that was moving toward both of them, and she had constructed a situation that would force me to dismantle it myself, using my own methods, arriving at conclusions I could not later doubt. She had been running the real investigation the entire time. I had been the test. "The child," I said, "is yours." she said, has always been yours. I sat down in the nearest chair because standing no longer felt like a reasonable option. She crossed the room and sat across from me, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes holding the same steady quality they had carried on the pavement 3 days ago. Your uncle made a second call 20 minutes ago, she said. I recorded it. She placed her phone on the table between us. Before we listen to it, she said quietly, I want you to understand something. I do not need to be rescued. I did not come back to be saved. I came back because this is also my child's world, and I decided it was worth making safer. She looked at me with the directness of someone who had thought carefully about every word before speaking it. What I need to know is whether you are capable of being honest. Not powerful, not protective. Honest. Outside the window, Seoul continued its ordinary morning, indifferent to two people sitting across from each other in a 7th-floor suite, deciding whether the distance between them was crossable. I reached across the table and pressed play on the recording. We listened together. It was a beginning, not a restoration of what had been, not a dramatic return to something whole, but the first honest conversation two people can have after they have both stopped pretending to be less complicated than they are. It was enough. For now, it was enough.